I walked into the Alpha King's hall to beg for an army, and I walked out having detonated the one vow he'd built his whole reign around, though neither of us understood in that first shattering moment that the vow and the begging were about to become the same impossible problem. Let me start where it has to start, which is with me and why I was there, because I did not come to High Ridge looking for a mate. I want that clear. I came looking for soldiers. My name is Astrid, and I was the envoy of the Rivermarch pack, the trusted voice my alpha sent when words had to be carried that mattered more than swords. I'd earned the role the hard way. I was clever, and I was cold-headed in a room full of hot tempers, and I did not flinch, and I did not flatter, and when my pack needed something from someone more powerful than us, it was me they sent to get it. And that autumn Rivermarch needed something badly. The Greyfang raiders had come down out of the northern hills, a brutal landless host that lived by burning what others built, and they had begun to bleed my people village by border village, and Rivermarch alone could not hold them. We needed an ally. We needed the one power on our border strong enough to break the Greyfang, the great pack of High Ridge and its king. I had watched 2 villages burn before I rode. That is what I carried into High Ridge's hall under the careful words and the negotiating terms, the smell of those villages, the faces of the people who'd fled to us with nothing, the children we couldn't feed, and the dead we couldn't bury fast enough. I was not on a diplomatic errand. I was on a rescue dressed up in an envoy's clothes, and every day High Ridge delayed was a day more of my people in the ground. I did not have the luxury of pride, or so I told myself on the ride. I would get the army if I had to crawl for it. I would learn in that hall that I had rather more pride than I'd budgeted for, but that comes later. So I rode to High Ridge with a delegation and a careful case, and the whole weight of my people's survival on my shoulders, and I prepared the way I always prepared. I learned everything I could about the man I'd have to persuade. And what I learned about King Leoric of High Ridge was strange, and it should have warned me. He was a strong king, that part was simple. High Ridge was vast and well-defended and feared, and Leoric had held it without a war for a decade through sheer cold competence. But there was a thing about him that everyone knew, and no one quite explained a thing that hung over his whole court like a held breath. King Leoric had sworn an oath. A public, absolute, decade-old oath that he would never take a mate. Not a political marriage, not a Luna, not the fated bond itself, nothing. He had sworn it young on taking the throne, and he had kept it with an iron will that had baffled and frustrated his whole pack for 10 years. The Luna's chair beside his throne sat pointedly, permanently empty. He had turned away every match, ignored every pressure, and ruled alone deliberately. A king who had decided that the one thing every alpha is supposed to want a mate at his side was the one thing he would never, ever allow himself. No one I asked could fully tell me why. They told me it had something to do with his father. They told me the old Alpha Leoric's father had been mate-bonded truly deeply, the real fated bond, to Leoric's mother, the Luna. And they told me that when the Luna died, when Leoric was a boy, his father had not survived it. Not been killed, not survived it. The broken bond had unmade the great Alpha from the inside grief, like a wound that would not close a strong king, wasting into a ghost, neglecting his pack, neglecting his son, following his mate into the grave within the year. And the boy Leoric had watched it happen, had watched the mate bond, the thing the songs call the greatest blessing a wolf can know, take his father apart and kill him slowly with love. And the boy had grown into a king who had decided with his whole will that he would never hand anyone that power over him, never take a mate, never make himself the thing he'd watched his father become, never leave his own pack to a grief-mad king. He would rule alone and keep the one vulnerability that destroys even the strongest alphas locked away forever, and the empty chair beside his throne was the monument to that vow. I filed all of this away as useful to know and nothing to do with me because I had come to negotiate an alliance, not to care about a cold king's tragic reasons. I rehearsed my case. I straightened my pack's colors, and I walked into the great hall of Highridge to beg King Leoric for the army that would save my people. The hall was vast and cold, the king grave and remote on his black throne with that empty chair beside him, and I crossed the long floor with my head high and my case ready, an envoy on the most important errand of my life. I reached the foot of the dais. I lifted my eyes to the King of Highridge to begin, and the bond hit us both like the world cracking open. I had not believed in it, not really, not for myself. I was 26 and pragmatic, and I'd half decided the fated bond was a thing that happened to other people in songs. It took me in that hall the way it takes you in the songs, a wrenching deep in my chest, my wolf surging up to scream a single word that had nothing to do with armies, my whole self lurching toward the cold king on the throne. Mate. And I watched it hit him in the same instant, watched King Leoric, who had sworn for 10 years that this exact thing would never happen to him, go rigid on his throne, his gray eyes snapping to me and locking his knuckles, whitening on the armrest, his whole face draining of its cold composure into something I can only call horror. Not wonder, not joy. Horror. I lost my speech. I want to be honest about that because I had crossed half the kingdom rehearsing it. The careful opening the appeal to shared interest, the terms, and in the space of a single heartbeat, every word of it evaporated because you cannot deliver a negotiating position while your own soul is trying to climb out of your chest toward a stranger on a throne. I stood at the foot of the dais with my mouth open and nothing coming out, and I watched the most powerful man on my border look at me like I was the end of the world, and I had the dizzying, vertiginous sense that the most important errand of my life had just been hijacked by something far larger and far more dangerous than the Greyfang raiders, something I had not come for, had not asked for, and did not, in that moment, have the first idea what to do with. The hall, which did not understand what had just happened, waited for the envoy to make her case, and the Alpha King of Highridge stared at me across his cold hall, like a man watching the one catastrophe he'd spent his entire life preventing walk in through his own front door, and said in a voice gone hoarse and strange before I could speak a word of my careful speech, "No." I had not asked anything yet, but I understood even then that he was not refusing my alliance. He was refusing me. He cleared the hall. That was the first thing he did, dismissed his entire court with a single sharp gesture, the negotiation my delegation, all of it, sent away so abruptly that my own people shot me bewildered looks as they were ushered out. And then it was just the two of us in that vast cold hall, the envoy and the king, with the broken open bond roaring between us and the empty Luna's chair, sitting there like a third presence. "You felt it," I said. There was no point pretending. My own voice was unsteady. "In front of your whole court. Don't tell me you didn't. I watched your face." I felt it. His jaw was tight. He had risen from the throne and now stood rigid, putting distance between us as though I were something dangerous. And it changes nothing. You should know that now, plainly, so we waste no time. I am not going to take a mate. I swore it 10 years ago, and I have kept that oath against every pressure my pack could bring, and I am not going to break it now because the moon in her cruelty decided to send mine walking into my hall on a day I'd half forgotten she could. His gray eyes were terrible. "I don't know why you've come to Highridge. I don't care. Whatever it is, my steward will hear it. But you and I are not going to be what the bond says we are. We are going to ignore it, and you are going to leave, and we are both going to go on with our lives as though this never happened. That is the only mercy available to either of us. Do you understand?" I should tell you what that did to me because it was not heartbreak, not yet. I barely knew him. It was fury. Because I had walked into that hall carrying my entire people's survival, the most important errand of my life, and a cold king had blown my negotiation to pieces and then informed me before I'd said a single word that I was a catastrophe to be managed and dispatched. I had been bond-struck in front of a whole court, a thing that had never happened to me, a thing that had knocked the breath out of me, and the man it bound me to had looked at me with horror and said no, and leave and mercy, as though I were a disease he was being gracious about. I had my pride. I had a great deal of pride. And I had a pack dying on the Greyfang's blades who needed his army far more than I needed his affection. "Let me be very clear with you, Your Majesty," I said, and my voice came out cold and steady and sharp as a blade, "because you seem to have badly misunderstood the situation. I did not come to High Ridge to be your mate. I did not come looking for the bond, or for you, or for a soulmate to complete my life. I came as the envoy of the Rivermarch pack to beg you for an army, because the Greyfang raiders are burning my people alive, and you are the only power on our border strong enough to stop them. The bond is—" I gestured at the air between us. "Furious and inconvenience, as far as I'm concerned. An accident of the moons that has nothing to do with why I'm standing in your hall. So you can keep your oath. You can ignore the bond. You can be as relieved as you like that I have no intention of holding you to a thing you swore off a decade ago. But you will not dispatch me like a problem. And you will not refuse my people their alliance, because you're frightened of what my arrival means for your vow. Those are two separate matters, and a king who confuses them is a worse king than your reputation suggests." The horror on his face shifted into surprise and then into something warier and more arrested, because I do not think anyone had spoken to King Leoric like that in a very long time, if ever. "You came to beg an army," he said slowly. "I came to negotiate one now," I corrected. "Rivermarch doesn't beg. We offer fair terms for fair aid, and the Greyfang are a threat to your border too. You'll find if you stop being frightened of me long enough to look at a map." I lifted my chin. "I'll thank you to keep your oath and your panic to yourself, and hear my case. As a king, here's an envoy because my people are dying, while you stand there managing your feelings about a bond I've already told you I won't enforce." And the Alpha King of High Ridge, sworn celibate, walled off 10 years rigid against the bond, looked at the furious envoy who just told him to get over himself, and something in his composure cracked in a way that had nothing to do with horror, and he said, almost to himself with a kind of dazed exasperation, "The moon has a vicious sense of humor. The moon," I said, "has nothing to do with my people dying. Hear my case. Your Majesty, or send a steward who will." He heard my case. I'll grant him that. Whatever his panic, he was not a man who let a real threat go unexamined, and the Greyfang were a real threat. And within the hour, he'd had a map unrolled and his commanders summoned, and the cold, competent king I'd been warned about reasserted himself over the bond-struck man, at least on the surface. The terms were fair. The logic was sound. The Greyfang would turn on High Ridge's own border villages soon enough, and a raider host broken on Rivermarch's plains was a host that never reached his lands. The alliance in pure strategy made sense, and Leoric was too good a king not to see it. But the bond sat in every meeting like a live coal, and it warped everything. I would be laying out a supply route and catch him watching me with an expression that was not at all a king assessing an envoy, and he'd look away, jaw tight, retreating behind his walls. I would feel the pull of the thing in the middle of a sentence and lose my place, furious at myself. We circled each other for days like that, two people conducting the most important negotiation of my life across a current neither of us would name him colder and more controlled with every passing day, precisely because the pull was getting stronger, me sharper and more businesslike for exactly the same reason. It was exhausting. And underneath my businesslike fury, something I did not want to admit was happening, I was beginning to like him. Not the cold king of the meetings, the man underneath, the one who flinched from the empty chair, the one whose competence was real and whose loneliness was realer, the one I caught, once standing alone in the hall at night staring at that empty seat like it was a grave. The bond pulled, yes, but it was the glimpses of the wounded man behind the wall that were the real danger, and I knew it. And I kept my guard up because a woman with a dying pack does not have time to fall for a king who's told her to her face that he'll never have her. Over the days that followed, because I refused to leave until my pack's alliance was settled, oath or no oath, bond or no bond, I began to see the shape of the man behind the refusal, and the shape was not arrogance. It was a wound old and deep and carefully guarded, and it lived in the empty chair beside his throne, and in the way he flinched every single time from the word mate. It came to a head a week later because I made it come to a head because I was tired of negotiating my people's survival in the cold gaps between a king's panic, and I wanted to understand what I was actually up against. The alliance talks had ground forward in fits and starts, Leoric to his credit. Did hear my case, and the terms were fair, and his own commanders agreed the Greyfang were a shared threat. The army was slowly becoming real. But the bond sat between us through every meeting like a live coal, and Leoric handled it by being colder and more controlled and more determinedly distant with every passing day, retreating behind his walls every time the pull of the thing showed on either of our faces. And I, who had told him the bond was an inconvenience, and half meant it found to my own irritation that it was becoming less of an inconvenience and more of an ache, because the man behind the cold was not cold at all, and I was beginning against every intention to want to know him. So one evening, when the day's talks were done, and it was just the two of us again in that hall with the empty chair, I stopped being an envoy and asked the question I'd been circling all week. "Why do you treat it like a curse?" I said. He looked up wary. "The bond. You look at me like I'm a catastrophe. You flinch from the word mate like it's a blade. You've sworn off the one thing every alpha I've ever known would give half his pack to have. And everyone says it's something about your father, and no one will tell me what, and I'm tired of negotiating around a wound I can't see. So tell me, why would a king reject his own fated mate before she's even spoken? What are you so afraid of?" For a long moment I thought he wouldn't answer, and then King Leoric of High Ridge sat down, not on his throne but on the steps of the dais, suddenly looking less like a king than like a tired man, and he told me. "My father was mate bonded to my mother," he said. "The real bond, the one the songs are about, and they were, I remember it, I was a boy, but I remember they were happy in a way that filled the whole keep. He was the greatest alpha in 3 generations, my father. Strong, certain, fearless. And then my mother died. A fever when I was 9. Nothing anyone could have stopped." His voice was very flat, the flatness of a thing held down hard. "And the bond, when a true bond breaks, when one mate dies, the other feels it. You know that. But I don't think anyone tells you what it can do. It unmade him. My father, the strongest man I ever knew, simply came apart. The grief of the broken bond was a wound that would not close, would not even scar. He stopped eating. He stopped ruling. He'd sit in the dark for days. He forgot he had a son. He was quiet for a moment, and when he went on, his voice had dropped lower into the place where the oldest wounds live. Do you know what the worst of it was? Not that he died. That he stopped seeing me. I was 9 years old, and I had lost my mother, and I needed my father. And my father was still alive, still breathing, sitting right there in the dark, and he was gone. The bond had taken him somewhere I couldn't reach. I used to sit with him for hours, and he wouldn't say a word, wouldn't look at me because all of him that was left was pointed at the grave where my mother was. I lost both my parents that year, Astrid, one to a fever and one to the fever's shadow, and the one who died slowly was worse because every day I had to watch the strongest man in the world be eaten alive by the very thing that was supposed to be the best part of his life. His jaw worked. Within a year he was dead, not killed. He just followed her. The bond that had been the great blessing of his life killed him as surely as a blade, slower and crueler, and I watched it happen every day from 9 years old to 10, watched love take apart the strongest man in the world and leave a half-orphaned boy to rule a pack his father had abandoned for grief. He looked at me then, and the horror I'd seen that first day was there again, but I understood it now. "So I swore," he said, "when I took the throne, that I would never take a mate, never hand anyone that power over me, never make myself what my father became, a king who could be destroyed not by an enemy, not by an army, but by love, by the simple act of losing someone the bond had tied to his soul." I would rule alone. I would keep the one weakness that brings down even the strongest alphas locked away where it could never reach me. And for 10 years I kept that oath, and the empty chair beside my throne is the proof of it. And I have been safe, Astrid, safe from the thing that killed my father for 10 years. His voice dropped. And then you walked into my hall, and the moon broke 10 years of safety in a single heartbeat. The one thing I swore would never happen to me. The catastrophe I built my whole reign around preventing it walked through my own front door on a Tuesday with a delegation and a map and a case about raiders. And I felt my father's death reach out of the past to claim me, and I was terrified, and I still am. That's why I treat it like a curse, because I watched what it does, and I would rather reject you and ache for the rest of my life than take you and risk becoming the thing that destroyed my father, or risk you becoming my mother dead and leaving me to come apart. That is the whole of it. That is why. The hall was silent, and I understood at last the man I'd been fighting, not a cold, arrogant king, rejecting a woman beneath him, but a terrified boy who'd watched love kill his father and had spent his whole life building walls against the same fate. The bond was real and undeniable and roaring between us still, and he was going to reject it anyway, oath intact, to save us both from his father's grave. The catastrophe he'd sworn off for a decade had walked into his hall in the shape of an envoy come to beg an army, and now I knew exactly why he would never ever let himself have her. It should have made me give up. It nearly did. But it also did something else. Something I didn't expect, because his father's story was not the only version of that story I knew, and the version I carried was about to matter more than either of us could have guessed. I did not give up, and the reason I didn't is the most important thing I have to tell you. So let me tell it properly. Because I knew his story. I had a version of it of my own. My own mother was mate bonded to my father, and my father died too. Not when I was a child, but when I was 19, a hunting accident, sudden and stupid and final. And my mother, mate bonded, felt the bond break, felt the same wound Leoric's father felt. I watched her grieve. It was terrible. I will not pretend it wasn't. The broken bond is a real and savage thing, and for a while I was afraid I'd lose her too, the way Leoric lost his father. There were weeks when she did not rise, when she did not eat, when the house went dark and silent, and I 19. And frightened, thought I was watching the same slow death Leoric had watched. I know that grief. I know what the broken bond does. I am not speaking to his fear from the outside. I have stood inside it. But my mother did not come apart. My mother survived it. Slowly, terribly, she came back, not because she loved my father any less than Leoric's father loved his mother, but because she made a choice every morning to keep living in a world that no longer had him in it. And years later, when I was grown, I asked her, because I needed to know, because I was a young woman wondering whether love was worth that kind of risk. I asked her whether if she could go back, knowing how it would end, knowing the agony the broken bond would cost her, she would choose not to bond with my father at all. Choose the safe path. Spare herself the wound. And my mother looked at me like I'd asked the stupidest question in the world, and she said, "Astrid, I would not trade a single ordinary morning with your father to be spared every hour of grieving him. Not one. The grief was the price of the joy, and the joy was worth any price. A life spent avoiding the pain of loss is just a different way of losing. You lose the love instead, and you lose it in advance, and you lose it for nothing." She took my face in her hands. "Don't you ever let the fear of losing something keep you from having it. That's not wisdom, child. That's just grief that arrives early and stays forever." So when Leoric told me his father's story and braced for me to recoil from a bond that destroys, I did not recoil. Because I had stood at the same crossroads he was standing at, watched the same catastrophe, asked the same question, and I had been given a different answer. And I knew with absolute certainty that his terror, however real, was built on only half the truth. "You think your father's death proves love is a fatal weakness?" I said. "It doesn't. It proves love is worth grieving. Those aren't the same thing, Leoric, and you've spent 10 years mistaking one for the other." And I told him about my mother, about the bond, the loss, the survival, and the thing she'd said I would not trade a single morning to be spared the grief. "Your father didn't die because love is a weakness," I said. "He died because he lost something so precious that losing it broke him. That's not a curse. That's the measure of how much he had. And you looked at the most precious thing a wolf can have and the grief it cost your father, and you decided the safe move was to never have it at all. But that's not safe, Leoric. That's just losing it in advance. You've spent 10 years grieving a love you won't even let yourself have. You're already living your father's grief, the loneliness, the empty chair, the walled-off life you've just cut out, the only part that made his worth it. You didn't avoid your father's fate. You chose the worst half of it and called it protection." He stared at me, and I watched the words land like blows, and I hoped I'd reached him. But a wall built over 17 years does not come down because someone says a true thing, and Leoric's voice when it came was hoarse and stubborn and still afraid. "I can't," he said. "I hear you, I do. But I watched him die, Astrid. I can't just decide not to be afraid of the thing I watched kill my father. I won't risk it. I won't risk becoming that, and I won't risk you becoming my mother. The answer is still no. It has to be. Go home to Rivermarch. You'll have your army. I'll send my forces against the Greyfang, I swear it. Your people will be saved. That much I can give you. But not me. Never me. Please, take the alliance and go before this gets any harder to undo." And that was the wall fully built, and it might have taken my army and my wounded pride and gone home, and we'd both have lived the rest of our lives aching behind our separate walls. Except that the Greyfang did not wait for the alliance to be signed. The word came at dawn, hard and terrible. The raiders had launched their largest assault yet, not on a border village this time, but a deep strike, fast and brutal. And it had fallen on the very delegation road my people held, and my own party, my Rivermarch kin who'd come with me, were caught in it, cut off fighting for their lives. And I did not think. I was an envoy, but I was Rivermarch first, and those were my people bleeding on that road. I called for a horse, and I rode out of Hyridge's gates and toward the fighting, toward my kin, into the path of the Greyfang host, because there was never any version where I sat safe in a hall while my people died. I did not stop to ask Leoric's leave. I did not stop to consider the bond or the oath or what my riding into danger might do to a man who'd watched love kill his father. I was a daughter of Rivermarch, and my people were dying, and I went the way I would always go because some loyalties don't pause to calculate. I learned later what happened in that hall when I rode out. I learned that King Leoric of Hyridge, who had spent a decade in a wall and an oath, keeping himself safe from the bond, watched his fated mate ride toward a battle, and felt the bottom drop out of the entire world. Felt the thing he'd been so afraid of arrive all at once, the terror of losing her total and unbearable, exactly the terror that had killed his father, except that he hadn't even had her yet. He'd rejected the bond, kept his oath, stayed safe, and it had made not one particle of difference, because the moment my life was in danger, the bond proved itself already complete, and he discovered in one gutting instant that he loved me, whether he'd claimed me or not, that his whole decade of protective rejection had bought him exactly nothing except the certainty that he'd lose me having never let himself have me. His commanders told me after that they had never seen the cold king move so fast, that he was on a horse and through the gates before the order had finished leaving his mouth, his guards scrambling to keep up the man who calculated everything, calculating nothing at all riding into a battle after a woman, the one thing he'd sworn for 10 years he would never let himself do because the wall had just shattered against the single force it could never withstand, which was the thought of her dying on a road while he sat safe and alone behind it. He rode after me. The sworn celibate king who'd never break his oath rode out of his own gates at the head of his guard into a battle after the woman he'd sworn never to take because the wall had just shattered against the one thing it could never withstand, which was the thought of her dying. The battle on the Delegation Road was short and savage, and we won it because Highridge's guard hit the Greyfang flank like a hammer just as my own people's line was breaking, and at the head of that hammer was King Leoric himself, fighting with a desperate ferocity that had nothing of his cold control in it. We drove the raiders off the road and saved my kin, and in the chaos and the blood and the aftermath, the king found me alive, bloodied, breathing, and the look on his face when he reached me was a thing I will never forget, because every wall the man had ever built was simply gone, blown to nothing, and what was underneath was raw and terrified and undone. He had a wound on his arm he didn't seem to feel. He had ridden into a raider host with no thought for his own safety, the strategist who never moved without 3 plans, and he crossed the bloody ground to me and gripped my shoulders and ran his hands over me, checking frantic for wounds like a man who needed the evidence of his own hands that I was whole, that the thing he'd feared on the ride out had not come true. "You rode into a battle," he said, gripping my shoulders, his voice shaking. "You rode toward the Greyfang. I watched you ride out, and He couldn't finish. His hands were trembling. "Astrid, I have to tell you what happened to me in that hall when you rode out, because it's the thing that finally taught me what an idiot I've been for 10 years. We did not have privacy. There was a battlefield around us, the wounded being gathered, the dead being counted, but he told me anyway because some things cannot wait for a better room. I rejected the bond to stay safe," he said, "to never risk what killed my father, and then I watched you ride toward death, and I felt my whole world end, the exact terror I'd spent a decade hiding from the bottom, dropping out, the grief reaching up to take me and Astrid. I hadn't even claimed you. I'd kept my oath. I'd stayed safe. And it made no difference. The bond was already complete. I already loved you. I was always going to be destroyed by losing you, oath or no oath, wall or no wall. Because the thing I was protecting myself from had already happened the moment you walked into my hall, and all my rejecting and refusing had bought me was the certainty that I'd lose you one day, having never let myself have you." His voice broke completely. "You were right. I wasn't avoiding my father's fate. I'd chosen the worst half of it. I was already living the grief, the loneliness, the fear, the empty chair, and I'd cut out the only part that made it worth surviving. The joy, the mornings, you. I've been so afraid of losing you that I almost made certain I'd lose you for nothing without one single day of the thing my father would have told me was worth any amount of grief." He pressed his forehead to mine there in the blood and the smoke. "I sat behind a wall for 10 years, thinking I was the only alpha wise enough to refuse the thing that destroys us. And it took watching you ride toward death to understand I wasn't wise. I was just a frightened boy who never grew past the worst day of his life. I'm done being him, Astrid. I'm done." I stood on that bloody road with my hands fisted in his torn cloak, and I made him say it plainly, because after a decade of an oath, I needed to hear it without hedging. "So what are you telling me, Leoric?" "I'm telling you I'm done being afraid," he said. "I'm telling you my father wouldn't have traded a single morning with my mother to spare himself the grief you told me that, and you were right, and I've spent 17 years too frightened to understand it. I'm telling you the oath is broken. It was the right oath for a terrified boy, and it's a coward's prison for a grown king, and I'm walking out of it. I'm telling you I love you. I have since you walked into my hall and told me to get over myself, and that I would rather have you and risk every grief the moon can invent than spend one more day safe and alone and slowly becoming the worst half of my father." He pressed his forehead to mine. "I'm telling you, I want to take my mate, finally, if she'll have a man who almost let his fear cost them both everything." We went home to High Ridge, both packs wounded, tended the Greyfang broken on the road, and soon to be broken entirely. By the alliance that was no longer in doubt, my people saved not by a king's cold calculation, but by a king who'd finally stopped being afraid of his own heart. And when we were back in that hall, the cold, vast hall with the empty Luna's chair, Leoric did the thing that told me more than any words on a battlefield, that the oath was truly, finally dead. He went to a locked box. I'd seen it before in his chambers, a small black box he kept and never opened, and I'd never asked. He opened it now with hands that were steadier than they'd been on the road, and he took out 2 rings, a matched pair old worn a man's and a woman's, the kind of paired tokens that bonded mates wear. "My parents," he said quietly. "My father's and my mother's. The rings they wore as mates. After he died, I locked them away. I couldn't bear to look at them, and I'd sworn no one would ever wear them again, because to me they were the proof of what the bond does, a monument to the thing I'd never allow." He turned them in his hand, and then he looked at me, and for the first time since I'd walked into his hall, there was no fear in his gray eyes at all, only something steady and certain and unafraid. "I've been wrong about what these are. They're not a monument to grief. They're a monument to a love so great that losing it broke the strongest man alive. That's not a warning, Astrid. That's the whole point of being given a heart. And I'd be a fool, I have been a fool, to keep them locked in the dark because I was too frightened to wear what my father wore." He held out the woman's ring, his mother's ring, on his open palm. And then because he was who he was, because even now, after a battle and a broken oath, he would not simply assume he did not slip it onto my hand. He made it mine. I looked at that ring on his palm and understood what it cost him to hold it out, that he was not only offering me a ring, he was offering me the very object he'd built his whole oath around the relic he'd locked in the dark for a decade, because he could not bear what it represented. To hold it out to me was to undo with his own hand the monument he'd spent 10 years tending. It was the bravest thing I ever saw him do, braver than the charge into the Greyfang, because the raiders could only have killed him, and this could break his heart. "I rejected you," he said, "in front of my whole court the day you walked in. I told you to leave, called you a catastrophe. Hurt your pride, made you doubt when you'd come carrying your whole people's survival, and deserved a king's respect, not a coward's panic. I have no right to assume you'll have me after that. So I'm not assuming. I'm asking. You told me that first day that you didn't come looking for a mate, that the bond was an inconvenience, and I have spent every day since proving you right to keep your guard up. But I'm asking anyway, humbly, after all of it, will you take a king who almost let his fear throw you away? Will you wear my mother's ring and fill that chair that sat empty for 10 years and be my mate? Not because the bond demands it, not because the moon decided it, but because I am finally brave enough to choose the thing I've been too afraid to want my whole life. Your choice, Astrid. After everything, it has to be yours. The moon may have made us mates, but I'll only wear that ring if you decide to wear this one freely, knowing exactly what a fool I've been." And I looked at the ring on his open palm, his mother's ring, the relic of the love that had both blessed and broken his family, and at the empty chair that had been a monument to his fear, and at the man who had ridden into a battle and out of a decade-long oath in a single day. And I made my choice. I had my pride. I want you to know I considered for one cold, proud second telling him it was too late, that he'd had his chance to want me with grace, and he'd thrown it away. But that would have been my own version of his cowardice, punishing a love to protect a pride, choosing the safe sting of refusal over the risk of the real thing. And I had a mother who taught me better. I would not trade a single morning to be spared the grief. I took the ring. I put it on myself the way I would do everything from then on, by choosing it. And I picked up the man's ring from the box, and I took his hand, and I slid it onto his finger, sealing the broken oath with the very tokens that had been its monument. "You're an idiot," I told him, as the rings settled into place, as something in his gray eyes broke open into pure, unguarded relief. A magnificent idiot who nearly cost us both everything because he was too frightened of grief to risk joy. "And I'm marrying you anyway, Leoric of High Ridge, not because of the bond, but because a man who can ride out of a 10-year oath in a single morning the moment it matters is a man worth choosing." I held his gaze. "But understand me. My mother was right, and you finally are too. The grief is the price, and the joy is worth any price, and I'm not interested in spending one more day of either of our lives being safe and alone. So fill the chair, break the oath, choose me out loud for good. The Alpha King of High Ridge, who had sworn for 10 years that he would never take a mate, pulled me into the empty Luna's chair beside his throne and kissed me in front of the hall where he'd once told me to leave, and filled the seat that had been a monument to his fear, and there was nothing safe or cold or walled about it at all. He'd been right about the bond. In the end, it is the one thing that can bring down even the strongest alpha. His father had taught him that, and it was true. But I taught him the other half, the half my mother taught me. The half, a frightened boy, had never been able to see that a love great enough to break you is a love worth being broken for, and that a life spent avoiding that risk isn't safety at all, it's just grief, with the joy cut out. We were wed before the winter in High Ridge's hall, and the empty chair beside the throne, the monument to 10 years of fear, was empty no longer. The pack that had spent a decade frustrated by their king's iron oath wept openly to see it filled at last. I had not understood until I saw their faces how much they had grieved alongside him, how heavily that empty seat had sat over all of them. A pack feels its alpha's loneliness the way a body feels a held breath. And when Leoric finally let it go, when he stood before them with my hand in his, and his mother's ring on my finger, and his father's on his own, the whole of High Ridge exhaled at once. 10 years of waiting, released in a single roar, and I felt for the first time that I had not only married a man, but mended something a whole people had been carrying. The Alpha King swore he'd never take a mate. For 10 years he kept that oath against everything behind his walls beside his empty chair, safe and certain and alone. And then I walked into his hall on a Tuesday to beg for an army and broke the safest vow in the kingdom, and I have never in all the full and frightening and joyful years since heard him express a single regret that I did. He keeps the box by the way, the little black box that once held his parents' rings locked away as a monument to grief. He keeps it on a shelf in our chambers empty, now the rings on our hands where they belong. To remember he says what I almost let fear talk me out of. And every time I catch him looking at it, he finds my hand, and the matched rings catch the light, and the chair beside the throne is never, ever empty again. He swore an oath once that he'd never take a mate, and I have come to think it was the most fortunate broken promise in the history of either of our packs, because everything good in the rest of my life began the moment he decided he'd rather be brave than safe.